Hey, what's happening, everybody? You're listening to Portraits in Color, a podcast that takes a unique look at race in America through the stories of artists, entrepreneurs, educators, and cultural critics. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Mirabal.
Welcome to Portraits in Color. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Mirabal. I'm here with a good friend and colleague, Tony Monfiletto. How you doing, my man?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
First of all, let's talk about that hoodie. That hoodie's pretty sharp, man.
I'm digging it. I'm a Pirates fan, but I'm a Roberto Clemente lover, man. So every time I can pick something up that's about Pittsburgh, I buy it.
So how is it that a guy from Albuquerque, New Mexico becomes a Pittsburgh Pirate fan? Is it solely because of Roberto?
Well, it's, when they were in the 70s, Willie Stargell and Roberto, Clemente before, I guess in the beginning of Stargell's career. But yeah, I was a big fan.
Yeah.
They were the first team to field an all-black lineup, and so, I had to root for them.
There you go. So we're here to talk about a really important subject, education reform, right? So first of all, you've been leading efforts with future-focused education. Why don't you talk a little bit about your organization and your role in it?
Sure. Well, Future Focused, it started as a school incubator. It became a network hub. And then the network itself now is providing the research and development for what I think are a lot of really important innovations around the state and actually around the country now.
Mm-hmm. So we're here to talk about the Reciprocity Project. So as we know, like school reform, the conversation for the longest time is like, how do we adequately measure student success? Mm-hmm. And we've gotten into this kind of pressurized testing environment, right? Mm-hmm. So like, let's give students instruction, but then let's go through months and months of standardized tests, mm-hmm. which we know there's been a lot of vocal opposition to that as a strategy. So talk about the model that you're proposing, Reciprocity Project.
Yeah, I appreciate the question because it's a big question. Mm-hmm. And I think that really what we're dealing with right now is I think a lot of the folks in the ed policy world and in the ed reform world are missing the opportunity to think big. Mm-hmm. So I think what we're doing is we're talking about things like, well, should we have testing this year with COVID? How can we deliver the same curriculum that we've always been delivering but do it online? Mm-hmm. Like the questions that we're asking are too small to deal with the challenge that's in front of us. And so I've learned, really since our work began, that you really can't talk about education and education reform unless you talk about race. And until you talk about institutional racism, it's really not possible to talk about the kind of change that we need to have. Mm-hmm. And so what's happening is we're starting to think about this work in a broader context of that until schools start thinking about young people and having their success be based on who they are and where they're from, as opposed to in spite of who they are and in spite of where they're from, we're never going to get the solution. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of schools that are messing around with things like racially sensitive curriculum or training their teachers to be more sensitive to the needs of their young people. Mm-hmm. All good, but not enough. Mm-hmm. And so in our opinion, we really need to think about reorienting schools so that they value the community that's around them, and so young people value the community that's around them, and dispel the myth that you have to leave your community behind in order to be successful. Mm-hmm. So it's a big problem. It's not a little problem that gets changed by getting a different textbook or delaying mm-hmm. testing or things like that.
And that kind of gets us back to the origins of schooling to begin with, right?
Yeah.
So like schooling has become the de facto kind of pathway into careers. Right, but the original intent of schools really was to build civic-minded individuals mm-hmm. that were actually contributing to their community and whatnot.
Right.
I remember when I was working on my PhD, there was a book that we had called Why Schools by Mike Rose. I don't know if you ever read that book.
I love Mike Rose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really interesting book, and it really got us to the foundations of education. So how can we get back to those foundations to where we are preparing young people for life, not just for careers?
Well, so much of what school's about is to rank kids, who's the best, and then sort them, based on what the ranking is. Mm-hmm. And when you have an institution that's built on a white supremacist framework, You're going to always be sorting kids of color
Right.
into bad jobs, bad career paths, bad graduation outcomes. And so if you really believe that every young person can make a contribution, every young person has value, is an asset to their community, then you really have to rethink not just the testing regime, but you have to rethink purpose. Like, why is the school here? Well, it's to make our communities better places to live, as opposed to just sorting and ranking kids so you can figure out who belongs in college and who doesn't belong in college.
There was this notion when I was a kid in terms of like the neighborhood that I grew up in. So I grew up in the South Valley. I grew up in the Kinney Brick area. And so I remember this as a life-changing experience for me when I had this conversation with a friend. We were talking about, I hadn't seen him in years. And I was like, hey man, so what are you up to these days? He said, I'm working with young people with this nonprofit organization in town. It's like, great. And it was like, you're teaching these young people, or you're getting these young people out of the hood. And he paused and he looked at me and he says, no, I'm not trying to get the kids out of the hood. I'm trying to make the hood a better place.
Yeah.
And that stuck with me my entire career. So how can we get to that place to where fundamentally we're looking at young people as assets and we're looking at the community to not only nurture them, but how do we look at education as a way of community development?
Yeah. Well, you're lucky. You're going to be talking to Monika and Kateri, who are the experts in this world.
Right.
I learned so much about the way to frame young people as assets from the work that Monika did at Health Leadership High School. And that school is still pursuing the same vision. And that vision is, you ask people, what does the community need? And then the school responds with projects with kids out in the community, helping do the work that makes communities healthier and more prosperous. But you have to have institutions that are oriented to the community, right? They're not, right now, all of our institutions are oriented up to APS, to the central office, or up to Santa Fe, and they're very compliance driven. They're regulatory in nature, and everybody's afraid that they're not, if they don't follow the rules, then there's gonna be hell to pay, right? And instead,
very paternalistic.
Oh, it's terrible, right? And it's the factory model, right? It's the ranking and sorting model. And so what we really need are schools that imagine themselves as being in partnership, reciprocal in nature with the community, willing to take the vision, the local wisdom of the community, and respond to it. It's a whole different frame. It's a different leadership frame, and it's a different set of outcomes, right? Because if you think about it, you would want to have schools that make communities better places to live. Well, how would you measure that?
Right.
And that's a big question, right? And it's something that needs time.
So let's stay there. So how would we measure that?
Well, I'll tell you one thing we would do is we'd start taking account of the number of young people that are out in the community that can't contribute, right? So they got pushed out of school, or they can contribute, but they never got served well in school. So they got pushed out of school, they're alienated from the community, they're alienated from school, and so schools actually are making communities poorer when these young people don't have a place to be, and their opportunities haven't been realized. So we really ought to be thinking about, well, what's the impact of all these young people out of school, nowhere to go and nothing to do? And that ought to be an accountability measure. Like, what does that cost on the community when those kids are, not involved or not making a contribution?
Yeah. So we're going to take a short pause, but when we come back, we're going to talk with Monika Stevens, and she's going to give us a little bit of an idea of how the community leans into this work. So stay tuned. All right, we're back. And so I have with me Monika Stevens. It's been a long time, my friend.
Yeah, glad to be here. Glad to see you.
Yeah, so a little bit of background. You and I have known each other since you were probably a teenager.
That's true.
You were a Youth Alliance member for the New Mexico Forum for Youth and Community, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. What about 2004?
Four? Yeah, 2004. That's about right.
Yeah, you were about 5 years old at the time.
I'm only 10 now.
Okay, yeah, I'm telling you. So yeah, thanks for being on the show. So we want to touch on a couple of topics when it comes to this Reciprocity Project model, specifically around, how does the community get engaged in the process of schooling? And so what are some of the ideas that you have? So, young people, the students themselves, their parents, and community members are empowered to make decisions about the schooling that's happening in their community.
Definitely. Oftentimes what we see now in models where schools are working with community, it's more just transactional. You know, people come in and come out. It's just like a guest speaker, or they might just do a survey. And really, to be in true reciprocity with a school, it's a true partnership working with community. So that can look like many different things. And most importantly, it's really doing school differently. You know, we have a school system that's embedded in like Eurocentric curriculum. The model even set up in systematic racism. So a school that's in reciprocity, true empowerment means like they're at the decision table making decisions, whether what the curriculum is, how students are engaged. And so young people can be contributors to their community to make a positive difference. The school can have an impact on the student as well as the community having an impact on the school. So it's like an ecological model approach where everybody's working together in all the moving parts to make things happen positively for the community.
So like in the traditional sense, if there's no student council at a school, what type of infrastructure would be needed for a young person to be, involved in their school and be able to make decisions?
Yeah, so I would say if a school wanted, so does the students want a student council or does the school want a student council?
That's an
right?
excellent point.
And so what are the students asking for? And so again, that's a different approach. Like I think about when I worked at Health Leadership High School, the students wanted a school council. And so they got to develop, what does the school student council look like? How do they engage? How do they meet? And so it might be meeting during school time, right? Meeting class time, if that's the best time that it works to meet, to engage more folks, right? And so I think that it looks very different. Even our school curriculum. So one thing that I think about for reciprocity is community members sharing ideas and concept of what curriculum can look like. And so for me, what that looks like is young people being empowered to improve their communities. And so there's so many issues that our young people want to be involved in, and why shouldn't that happen while the time where they're at school?
So is like service learning a big part of it?
So kind of like service learning, but I think of it as like schools should be a space where young people can organize. So like teachers are facilitating organizing. Teachers themselves like end up becoming organizers, and they're facilitating young people to be in those spaces to lead. And so I think about like the whole education system. It should we should toss it out the way that it looks now and build it from the ground up. And
Right.
with
There's lots of work to be done.
lots of work. Yeah. So I think my ideas are really great for maybe a community that I reside in, in the South Broadway area. But there's other community ideas that people envision and would like to see. Like I would love to see our students and our communities like healthier. I would love to see our students being able to see themselves as assets in the community and our families. And oftentimes they don't feel empowered to make those decisions because it's really watered down.
And so how do you like look at equity in a different way as well? So like, what about like the Spanish-speaking parents in a community that have often felt left out because they don't speak the dominant culture language? So what are some ideas in terms of like engaging populations like that?
That is so important. I think that what I've seen some schools do and really work well is they have like family liaisons, and those family liaisons aren't necessarily volunteering their time, they're being paid. And so because they come from the community, because they know the needs, they're able to create those spaces where people who are bilingual are included. And so it's I've been to meetings where the whole meeting is in Spanish, and I'm the one who's receiving the translations like in English, because the whole community speaks Spanish. So instead of just doing a Spanish meeting and getting everybody translations, like vice versa. And so I think that like is showing how it's meeting the needs of the population that's there.
And so how do you integrate some of the other community members into this type of design? So I'm thinking like there's businesses surrounding the school. There are, so there's so many like faith leaders. So often, they're a major asset in the community, and they're a place where people congregate. So how do you incorporate these other assets within the community in this type of design?
Yeah, I think schools have a really unique opportunity. They can asset map all those different things that you said. Like you can asset map things within 30-mile radiuses. What are those businesses? What are those faith institutions? What are the nonprofit organizations? Who are the community leaders? What are some of the issues that are happening in the community? And after that, start reaching out. Start reaching out to say, hey, we're a school, we've been here so many years, and we're trying to do something different, and we cannot do it without you. Even learning about what those faith leaders have been doing, what those businesses have been doing. Like I think about this organization is right across the street from a school that's learning about entrepreneurship, Symbiotic Leadership High School. And what if some of those students are interested in video production and design? And so if the school was able to do some of those asset mapping, it's an opportunity to partner, to learn together. And the organization's able to identify, well, here's the ways we can partner. And they get to explore and build together. So it's a very different model about building together for the whole community, not just for like a small project or something that's transactional.
Such a novel idea, right?
Yeah.
So let's end on the organizing piece, right? So often what ends up happening is young people or their families, the community organizes because they're really pushing for change. Oftentimes that organizing resides outside of the school, because if it resides in the school, then there seems to be like this unhealthy conflict, right? So how does organizing really play into this model to where, youth, their families, businesses can really push towards the type of change that they want to see in their community, not just the school, but in the community?
Yeah, like one thing I think about is I recently attended Families United for Education. They had a rally, and due to the pandemic, they did it via Zoom. And those young people were engaged in creating a zine and talking about what they wanted to see in a superintendent. And they wanted to be in the process of picking a superintendent. Imagine if those conversations were being had at a school where young people are able to learn, what is a superintendent? What's the role of the superintendent? And so they can organize in a school during a school time to have those critical conversations and learn and grow. And so that's something's meaningful. That's something that's important. It's going to impact thousands of kids in the Albuquerque public school systems. Our students should have a voice about what it means to them.
All right. So we're going to take a short break, but when we come back, we're going to go a little bit deeper in terms of racial equity. So sit tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're here with Kateri Zuni from Future Focus Education. You're on the board, correct?
Yes.
So I want to talk a little bit more about racism in particular and how it plays out in curriculum, right? A perfect example is we were taught since we were little kids that Columbus was the good guy, right? He discovered America and this and that. And we know through our own history and stories from our families that that wasn't true. So dive a little bit deeper in terms of like racism, how it plays out in curriculum.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we think about curriculum, especially when it comes from, public schools, it's really, it's the way we kind of indoctrinate young people to kind of accept this greater idea of American dream or understanding the American narrative.
The melting pot, right?
Exactly, yeah. And so what happens a lot of times in my own experience, not only as, remembering my experience as a student, but also now as a mother, what it results in is parents then having to do a lot of unlearning with your students and correcting that kind of indoctrination that happens. And it's really hard because our young people, especially, really young people in elementary school, they look to their teacher and teacher is everything, she or he, they know it all. I get everything I need from them. And so correcting the teacher becomes, a really kind of hard thing for a parent to do. And it requires a lot of pivoting and trying to figure out a way to explain this to you so that you're not only questioning yourself, but, still being able to go to school and trust what you are learning that is correct and accurate.
Well, there's a lot of research that's even done like in Latino communities, Latinx communities, where, Mexican parents will not ask any questions of the teacher or challenge a teacher in any way because, in the culture, it's like you respect them as the authority
Right.
and as the expert, so you would never challenge that. So you're a parent now. Yeah,
Yes.
and you're raising a child that's in school. So in what ways do you see schooling needs to change to better suit the needs of your child as opposed to, the schooling that you went through?
Yeah, I think we need to start with honesty and just really saying yes.
What a novel idea, right?
Right, and trusting that young people can handle the truth about their own histories. My son I'm from Isleta Pueblo and Zuni Pueblo, so my son is half Native, he's half Black, and those are two parts of our cultural curriculum that are so often mishandled. Our young people are fed outright lies, if not racist propaganda, to understand their own histories. And so I think starting with being honest about where schools and curriculums have failed in the past, and accepting that the knowledge of our communities is valid knowledge, it's valid experience, and we can learn from that, I think would be a great first step.
So in a school that is rooted in community, so how do you bring in like the voices of the elders, like we talk so much in American Indian culture, of how our elders are the storytellers, they're the historians. How can we bring in elements of our indigenous past into schooling?
I mean, I think it needs to it requires a shift in a way. So much of what the communication is between schools and communities is the school designates a time when they can invite people in, and meaning parents and community members, to kind of give a download of what's happening at the school. This is what we're doing, this is what we're gonna do, this is what's available for you. I think it really needs to be, as the Reciprocity Project, sets up, more of a reciprocal conversation, and rather the school saying, this is what you get, what do you need? And I think that first step of integrating community members is one way to do it, and one way to gain the trust of community, to understand that you don't want my time as an elder or as somebody who is a cultural leader for just this moment, and then you're done with me, which it happens in schools, but it also happens in media and all other facets of our society. So I think just kind of understanding that it can't be this one-time transactional deal. It needs to be an ongoing relationship. And like I said earlier, I think schools and institutions of learning in general really need to reconcile what they mean, or what it means when we say that knowledge or a way of knowing is the way of knowing, the best way of knowing. So cultural ways of knowing are very different from institutional ways of knowing. And recognizing those and giving those, the respect that they deserve is also another way to do that.
So what role, if any, do schools in this reciprocal model, what role do they have in terms of healing divides? How can they heal some of these divides that have been, generations in the making?
I mean, we're hearing a lot about healing right now in our greater kind of dialogue, right? And I think that, as I said earlier, I think it needs to start with honesty and
another novel concept, right?
Yeah, correct. Again,
something we're not quite used to over the last 4 years.
But schools have the advantage. Schools have the advantage of the infrastructure. They have the advantage of maybe not as much as we'd like, but they have the advantage of funding. They have they can serve as the hub to really bring community in and facilitate, whether it be discussion, whether it be building curriculum with community members and students. I mean, this is kind of the place where schools and school administrators can be that take that lead, and know when to step back and say, okay, this is the space we can open up. What do you need from us? Because it's not ever going to work to heal the community if it's dictated by the institution of the school.
And with a lot of the healing models that are out there, that I'm sometimes critical of them, because the thing about it is you can't really get to the sense of healing until you get a sense of, number one, the truth, And there's been a lot of that in the discourse lately. And secondly, you got to stop the oppressive behaviors, of the oppressor.
Right, yeah. So if your school, for example, wanted to have a discussion about healing, let's also look at, what are the rates of your students who are POC versus white students who are suspended often or go to the principal often? Like, is there disparity there? Across the nation, yes, there is disparity there. So let's be honest about that. Let's talk about why that happens. Let's talk about, the biases that people naturally hold. All of us hold racial biases.
For sure.
Are your teachers getting training on that? Are they working through what that means in terms of grading or, punishment? Things like that need to happen. So it's a matter of looking at all those small areas that people don't necessarily maybe see as equivalent to this like healing buzzword.
Yeah. So let's end with how we go about disrupting the school to prison pipeline, right? So the thing about it is we know that students of color are disproportionately disciplined in school. I mean, there's lots of studies around that. And that becomes a predictor for incarceration rates down the road. So how do we begin to look at school discipline and issues of that nature to disrupt this school to prison pipeline?
Well, I think Monika definitely she takes the cake in terms of, knowing what it means. But I think ultimately looking at things like, why are we still making money off of imprisoning people? Those are like the larger questions, because we can't look at that.
Some things shouldn't be privatized, right?
Exactly.
Because the incentive is profit.
Exactly. And, I think that it all kind of trickles down from there, because it's so easy to offer up our young people and set them up in a way that just only feeds that system, only feeds that machine. So, there's so much that goes into that discussion of school to prison pipelines and looking at what abolition means today that, we have to start somewhere, and I think that is addressing the foundational racism in our school system.
Kateri, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So if people want to learn more about the Reciprocity Project, where would they go?
They should follow Future Focused Education by visiting futurefocusededucation.org or on social media. And then very soon from there, there'll be more information about the official launch of websites for the Reciprocity Project.
Thanks everybody for tuning in to Portraits in Color. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Mirabal. You can catch me on social media at Frank Mirabal on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can also catch the show on any platform streaming podcasts. So until next time, peace.